Welcome everyone. My name is Sean McEwen. I'm a workplace diversity and inclusion consultant with Realized Capacity Consultants. I work out of Calgary, Alberta, Treaty 7 territory. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to Hire for Talent's Leading Inclusion session about workplace diversity and leveraging the talents of people with disabilities. The main objectives for this session are just to develop a deeper understanding of workplace diversity and inclusion. Those things are similar but different. We'll talk more about that. Understanding sustainable workforce strategies and what that means in the face of coming demographic trends in Canada. As well, identifying common ground in employer and service provider objectives. All those publicly funded service providers who exist to help underrepresented groups get into the workforce. There's a lot of assets there that employers can leverage. And of course, identifying strategies for effective collaboration for us to achieve our goals in the future of work. So let's start with a fairly radical concept. The workplace inclusion of people with disabilities can help future-proof your business. When something's new to us, we often perceive it as a risk, but in the case of hiring people with disabilities, we're actually mitigating risk. Again, the workplace inclusion of people with disabilities can help future-proof your business. In order to understand how the workplace inclusion of people with disabilities can help future-proof your business, we have to look at what's happening to our workforce and why diversity and inclusion matter so much. So let's get right into that. Why do diversity and inclusion matter so much? These primary points are what we would put forth: sustainable workforce development, positive workplace culture and performance, attracting talent, and enhancing company brand, especially as the diversity of our workforce and customer increases. These are some very important reasons why diversity and inclusion matter. There are more that we'll talk about, but let's explore these specific reasons on a deeper level. So sustainable workforce development, what I'm referring to when I talk about that is the fact that right now, across the globe, 60% of humans are living in countries with stagnant or shrinking workforces. And in Canada, this is a pretty profound impact on our workforce. In Canada, between now and 2035, Canada's projected to lose 25% of its workforce. That's a lot of people, 5 million people, aging out of the workforce. And the only way for Canada to replace those workers is through tapping the talents of underrepresented groups and looking at immigration. So what we're going to see some pretty sweeping changes to our workforce. Immigration and untapped talent pools are required. Diversity and inclusion will all factor into job choices for those folks, as well as workplace culture. And what we really need to be asking ourselves is, given all of these coming changes, who will be the employers of choice in the future of work? So let's look at diversity and inclusion a little bit deeper here. We know 25% of our population is aging out. We also know that there are over 6 million people with disabilities in Canada, working age people. Right now, over 22% of Canadians identify as having a permanent disability of some kind. If you add in mental health disabilities, which are considered episodic disabilities, by the age of 40, 50% of Canadians will experience a mental illness of some type or another. So when we think about disability, we really need to be thinking of a broad spectrum of people that may have vision loss or hearing loss, learning disabilities, ADD, autism, medical disabilities. There's such a wide range of disability that whatever we think we know about disability, we're probably wrong about it. There's probably more to it than that. And speaking as a person who has worked his entire adult life in disability services, I can attest to the fact that I learn new things about disability every week of my career. So the reason that people with disabilities, the reason that this group should matter so much to employers is that this specific group, especially when combined with employment service providers and their workplace inclusion offerings, this can offer employers a way to really hack workplace equity, diversity, and inclusion. So let's talk a bit more about some of these coming gaps, and we'll come back to the benefits of hiring people with disabilities. We know right now, immigrants make up about 65% of Canada's net annual population growth. But by 2035, this is going to be almost 100% of our population growth. The other groups that will be a big part of our workforce will be millennials and Gen Z, who right now comprise over 50% of our workforce, and within a few short years will rise up to over 70% of our workforce. When we look at these combined factors, what we see is that our workforce is getting younger and more diverse every passing month. And COVID has actually just accelerated all of this. COVID has accelerated the diversity of our job market, and it's also accelerated the fact that it is a job seeker's job market. All of these factors create issues for employers when we're considering attracting talent. Let's talk a bit about workplace culture, because this is a really significant factor in equity, diversity, and inclusion, and a really significant factor in attracting talent in the future of work. So workplace culture has a direct correlation with performance. When we think of workplace culture, we think about a lot of kind of nebulous things about values and beliefs and assumptions, policies, how we decorate the workspace. There's so many impacts around workplace culture, so many facets around workplace culture. But really what workplace culture is about is behavior. It's about the ways that we interact with each other, very specifically the range of actions that are expected, delivered, or tolerated at work. And a foundational element of good workplace culture is inclusion. Most workplaces get pretty busy doing the daily operational things that they do for work, and we don't always give as much time and attention as we'd like to workplace culture. But what's really important to note is that workplace culture has an extremely significant impact on performance. Workplace culture can help speed your business towards growth, innovation, and profit, or conversely, if it's not a good workplace culture, it can be a real ball and chain that holds you back. Inclusive workplace cultures attract and engage employees. That is something that we're seeing increase significantly right now. We're seeing a lot of job seekers become very interested in what is the workplace culture before they agree to work there. In terms of workplace culture and engagement, we have some good news and bad news in Canada. The good news is that Canada has one of the most engaged employees in the planet at 30%. So 30% of Canadian workers feel engaged at work, and 70% of workers feel not engaged or actively disengaged. And when we think about workplace culture and the ways that workplace culture can be used to increase engagement of people, what would happen to Canadian business if we could flip these numbers upside down? What would happen if we could have 70% of people feeling really engaged at work instead of 30%? These are very well-researched, measurable stats on the engagement of employees conducted by Gallup, which is an international organization studying workforce trends. A healthy workplace culture, one that understands inclusion and a strengths-based approach to employment, has a big impact on engagement and productivity. Culture is a critical factor in building workplace diversity and inclusion. Let's look at some of the metrics around this. So when we compare low engagement cultures and high engagement cultures, these are some of the disparities that we see, some of the improvements. And this is from Gallup's 2017 State of the Global Workplace report that surveyed people across 150 countries around the globe. So what we see instantly is some noticeable increase in good things like customer metrics, productivity, sales. What really is impactful is a vast reduction of negative elements of work. So 40% lower absenteeism with a higher level of employee engagement and higher quality workplace culture. Almost 60% lower turnover in higher turnover organizations. If you think about just the sheer costs of that kind of turnover, that has a pretty profound impact on your business. 70% fewer employee safety incidents. As we can see, there's very significant correlations between employee engagement and business performance. Attracting new talent. This is another reason why equity, diversity, and inclusion matter so much. As we talked about, millennials and Gen Z are a growing segment of the workforce and will comprise over 70% of our workforce by 2025. Almost 100% of our population growth is going to come from immigration by 2035. We know that diversity and inclusion and workplace culture are factoring more and more into job choices for people. We also know, especially as COVID unfolded, gig economy, being able to work remotely, being able to work for Uber, Skip the Dishes, DoorDash, all of these kinds of gig economy elements of work are expanding. And we really need to, again, consider how will we be employers of choice in the future of work. What we have seen through COVID, what was predicted was an increasing job seekers market. And that's already here. We're already seeing employers struggling to attract and retain talent. And that problem is actually going to get worse before it gets better. Getting better at workplace equity, diversity, and inclusion is a way for you to attract and retain talent. As job seekers consider more and more about how they want their work life to look, this is a really important factor. Harvard Business Review has cited a seismic shift in the way that people view work. And we know that this is happening. We know that job seekers are considering more and more who are they working for and what's their return on investment. This is something businesses understand, return on investment. Job seekers are starting to wonder, what's their return on investment? How can we get better at workplace equity, diversity, and inclusion? So there's a lot of complexities to this, a lot of complexities to workplace diversity and inclusion, trying to shift or improve workplace cultures. These things can seem pretty overwhelming to folks. Most employers understand the what and why of diversity and inclusion. It's the how part that they really struggle with. And what's very notable and very important for employers across Canada to realize is that the federal government and provincial governments are investing huge amounts of money in helping underrepresented groups to get into the workforce. So this includes people with disabilities, newcomers, Indigenous people. There's a lot of public investment in services that can help employers tap into diverse talent groups. And specifically, folks with disabilities are being well served right across Canada. This is something that we need to talk about because understanding what diversity and inclusion are, those are important factors. But how to do it, that is something that service providers across Canada have been specializing in for the last 30 years. They've been getting better and better at how do we onboard and mentor and train and communicate with people with disabilities. Those are very transferable skills to other equity deserving groups. Let's talk a little bit about diversity and inclusion and what those things specifically mean. We throw the terms around a lot, but it's good to really look at what they mean and why they're important. So diversity can simply reference the full spectrum of human demographic differences, such as race, sexual orientation, religion, gender, age, and disability. What's important about diversity is not just having a range of people, it's the fact that that range of people improves the problem solving of business, that those different lived experiences, new approaches, ways of thinking about things, this is really important. It's something that we've really discovered. Having those different perspectives makes us stronger. So this is a simple definition of diversity. Again, we're focusing on disability as diversity within these sessions because, again, this is a diversity group that can have a profound impact on workplace equity, diversity, and inclusion, especially when paired with service providers. It's worth noting that the future of work will be full of problems that we haven't even thought of yet. If you think about your last 10 years of career and things that have changed through that time period, we know things are changing. We know there are problems that we haven't even considered yet. People with disabilities have generally been solving problems their whole lives that the rest of us haven't even had to think about. And there is benefit in that. There is strength in that that can be utilized by workplaces. Inclusion, this is a little bit deeper. Inclusion can be considered a sense of belonging, feeling heard, valued, and respected. What's important to note about inclusion is that it's a significant factor in workplace psychological health and safety. Inclusion is something that every single human needs. It's not specific to diversity groups. Everybody needs to feel included. what's worth considering is that people who have elevated status, people who are part of the dominant culture, they don't necessarily notice that inclusion is so important because they get it a lot. They get inclusion a lot. Everyone's had experiences where they're not feeling included. We're going to talk about that. But it's important to note inclusion isn't a passive thing that happens just because we value it. Much like workplace culture, inclusion is communicated through behavior. It's demonstrated by our actions towards each other, and it's an element of workplace culture that benefits all employees by helping them feel safe and welcome. And this is absolutely a performance enhancer and an engagement enhancer. People who are not included at work, if you're allowing anything to happen at work that's interfering with people's inclusion, they're not going to contribute as much, and they're more likely to leave. So there are harsh costs to that for business. In order to fully understand inclusion, I think it really helps to look at its opposite and what are the impacts of that. So if we look at exclusion, feeling ostracized, cast aside, unseen, unvalued, alone, inconsequential, even as I say those words and as you read those words, there might be a slight bit of discomfort. And there's important reasons for this. If you even think about times in your life where you have felt excluded, and maybe it was something as simple as waiting for friends to show up at a party and they were late and you were standing there with no one talking to you for a while. Everyone has some experience with exclusion. And we know that in those moments, we feel discomfort and we don't feel connected. And there is even some subtle degree of threat to it. And there's very clear reasons for this. Inclusion needs to be deeply embedded in our workplace culture because if it's not, our organizations are paying for its absence. That lack of inclusion will absolutely negatively impact performance and engagement. So why? Why does inclusion matter so much to humans? Very simply, evolution, psychology, the last 4 to 7 million years of human evolution, we perceived social connections as essential to our survival. Humans literally survived because we lived in groups. And as a result, we're very hardwired to perceive relatedness as safe and rewarding and to view exclusion as unsafe, as a threat. Our brains still read social needs similarly to primary threats and rewards. And neuroscience has showed that exclusion activates basic survival responses. There's some great resources that you could look at through an organization called Neuroleadership. Neuroleadership.com is their website. And if you want to learn more about this, it's very interesting material. So really, for all of us, inclusion isn't some hallmark feel-good thing that folks need just to soothe them. This is a very critical element of human psychology. Safe connections are vital for health and collaboration. And this is something that employers, if they can get their heads around it, that fostering a more inclusive work environment will lead to better equity, diversity, and inclusion, will lead to better workplace culture, and will improve your ability to attract and retain talent. When we look at exclusion and inclusion factors at work, some of the research and studies around this are really interesting in that these threats to our inclusion that for over 1 million years were a threat to our survival, they continue living on with us. And what's impactful is that even witnessing behaviors that exclude our coworkers at work can make us lose trust and engagement in that workplace. There's a very profound impact on us. So we know that inclusion is a universal need. We know that inclusion matters to all of us and that when we're included, we're reasonably happy, we feel valued. But it's also important for leaders to keep in mind that they might have a different view of inclusion at work. And statistically, leaders do rate inclusion higher than the employees that work for them, up to 20% higher. So when you're a person who has actual or perceived status at work, you're likely to feel more included. You're likely to feel like you've got more autonomy and control in that environment. So it's very important for leaders to understand their view of inclusion isn't necessarily the whole workplace's view of inclusion. Hiring somebody with a disability for the first time really takes us as employers, as leaders, as managers, it takes us out of our comfort zone and it diverts our attention to actions and protocols that include people and support their success. And ideally, that attention and action becomes habit. And this is why hiring, mentoring, and accommodating people with disabilities can help employers to better hire, mentor, and accommodate all of their new employees, thereby fast-tracking workplace equity, diversity, and inclusion. There's an interesting concept called inclusive design. So if we can explore this a little bit, this is a concept that helps us simplify diversity and inclusion and workplace accommodation. And there are many types of diversity, and although that can seem overwhelming sometimes to employers, what we need to remember is that humans are generally pretty similar psychologically. We're generally categorizing things as threats or rewards, and as such, our needs are actually more simply met than we think. Inclusive design really looks at creating systems and spaces that work for everyone. And these are strategies and protocols that work for every prospective diversity hire because they're all human and they're all working with that human psychology. Also, a lot of accessibility and accommodation issues can be proactively addressed through inclusive design. So it's about designing things, environments, and systems in a way that works for everyone. And I know you might think, as a small business owner, I don't design anything at work, but you do. You choose workspace, you choose the layout of that workspace. Whether that workspace is accessible or not is a choice. Even something as simple as policies, those are a design process. Job postings, job interviews, the questions that you will ask, you're constantly designing things at work. So what's really important is as you're going through that design process, as you're making a choice about how will we construct this specific protocol or process or communication at work, asking yourself who might be excluded by this environment, this process, this system, who might be excluded by that, and correcting it before you finalize the decision. This is the kind of creative thinking that service providers have to do all the time when we're helping employers with onboarding and training and retention. But it's also the kind of creative thinking that workplaces really start to build their capacity in and engage in when they employ a person with a disability. Disability inclusion literally trains more inclusive behaviors at work. We get much better at the things that we're doing than the things we're thinking about. This is another reason why Hire for Talent is so supportive of employers across Canada hiring people with disabilities, because they realize that the future of work is going to require some capacity building in equity, diversity, and inclusion. And they realize that hiring people with disabilities will coach more inclusive workplace cultures. So when you think about equity, diversity, and inclusion, that's great that you're thinking about it. It's important to reflect on these things, but to actually do things makes us a lot better at them than to merely think about them. And when we look at the possibility of at least interviewing people with disabilities by reaching out to a service provider, and you can find those service providers on the Hire for Talent website, when we do that, we're teaching ourselves new things. We're building skills and strengths and capacity. Let's look at an example of inclusive design. This slide, you've probably seen it before. It was originally intended to show the difference between equality and equity, but I think it's a great slide to illustrate inclusive design. So in the first image, you can see that someone is being excluded, isn't fully able to access the benefits of this environment. In the second slide, you can see people have gone through considerable effort to accommodate the person. And then the third slide, you can see what an example of inclusive design would be. We would let's just make this work for everyone right from the start. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about inclusive design. We see examples of this in the built environment in terms of wheelchair ramps, automated door openers, things like that. What is important about inclusive design is to realize this isn't just for folks with disabilities. Over the lifespan, people will access different things that were originally designed as accessibility devices. So for instance, the wheelchair ramp at the shopping mall. I don't actually remember the last time I saw a person using a wheelchair on a wheelchair ramp at the shopping mall. I see older folks walking with canes. I see parents pushing strollers. I see delivery people with dollies full of heavy equipment. That's an element of inclusive design, designing things that work for the most possible people. Let's look at how to do some of that stuff at work. So, inclusive design in a workplace, how do we do that? There's so many elements of recruitment, retention, workplace design. When we look at something as simple as employment accessibility, how easy is it for people to even access employment at your organization? It's super common for us to post jobs online using applicant tracking systems, but are those systems in fact the most accessible systems for people? That's something that we often have blind spots about if we don't personally experience those barriers. So folks with disabilities, whether it's dyslexia or a learning disability or low vision, they may not be able to effectively complete that application. Likewise, folks with English as a second language might struggle to complete that application. Something as simple as making a statement on your job posting, if you have a disability-based barrier or a language-based barrier to applying for this job, please call us at and provide a phone number. That's a way to make your employment more inclusive and more accessible. Likewise, when we phone candidates, let them know we want to interview you at 9 o'clock next Tuesday morning. We'll have a 3-person panel interview on the second floor of a walk-up building. We're going to ask you behavioral descriptive questions, ask you to tell us stories about a time that you had to deal with a workplace conflict or a time that you had to exercise good judgment. Tell us a story about those things. And then at the end of it, we're going to have a 15-minute Microsoft Excel test. If you can describe exactly what you're going to do with the candidate for an interview, if you can describe that and then ask them, do you need any type of accommodation for that? You cannot be denied the interview for requesting accommodation. This is our policy. What I experience when I ask people that is 90% of the time, they don't require any type of accommodation. And the times that they do, it's very easy for us to accommodate that. They very often express how impressed they are that we're an inclusive employer. So you're also communicating that you have some commitment to inclusion. Another inclusive design element, workplace orientation, employee orientation. How do people learn at work? This is a combination of social learning and work routines. If a mentor is assigned, then the person is going to have increased access to that knowledge. They'll learn the work routine faster, but they'll also have more access to social learning. Is that something that works well for people with disabilities? Yes. Will it work well for every single person you hire? Yes. That's an example of inclusive design. As is workplace culture, psychological health and safety. Those are things that benefit all people. Having civility and respect, recognition and reward, clear leadership and expectations at work, that's going to serve every single employee. So looking at inclusive design can be incredibly important to employers. Cultural agility, especially for leaders and managers, supervisors, recognizing that other people face different barriers than you do. And just because you haven't experienced those barriers doesn't mean they're not real for that person. So having some ability to understand where adjustment, flexibility, or accommodation might be needed. That's an example of inclusive design as applied to leadership, as is emotional intelligence, awareness of yourself, your biases, awareness of micro inequities. These are important things. Service providers can help employers become familiar with inclusive design, and you may find your non-disabled employees thanking you for just understanding this better. It tends to make the workplace more inclusive for all of us. Learning about these things is a good start. You can Google inclusive design and learn some very interesting things about it. But what's really important is not just gaining knowledge, but embedding that knowledge in our workplaces, in our work routines. What will you do with this information? That's an important question for you as you go through this session. So let's look at a framework for diversity and inclusion success. I hear a lot from employers, I don't know, do we need to make ourselves more inclusive first before we start hiring people from diversity groups? And I don't know how you would effectively do that, because you're going to learn from those diversity groups where your blind spots are and what kinds of things you need to get better at. This is all a journey. No one's expected to be perfect at it right out of the gate. And again, the service providers that I keep talking about can help you with that. So, framework for diversity and inclusion success. As it turns out, the first thing isn't diversity or inclusion, it's growth mindset. It's also intentional workplace culture, and it's also collaborative and experiential learning. So let's explore these 3 bullet points a bit, starting with growth mindset, which is simply the belief that you and your colleagues or employees are capable of acquiring and applying new knowledge. So what do we believe about our capacity to learn, collaborate, and apply new knowledge? The reason this is so important when it comes to diversity and inclusion is that we don't know everything, and we don't actually even know the things that we don't know yet. So understanding that there are things you need to learn, there are things you need to get better at, and you believe in your capacity to do so, that is the place that we need to be starting with workplace equity, diversity, and inclusion. And growth mindset is absolutely critical to culture change. If you believe that you already know everything that you need to know, you don't need new information, you're not going to be able to change a workplace culture or improve it. Intentional workplace culture. This is really important because as we discussed earlier, leaders don't always see the whole workplace culture. They don't always face the barriers that others do. So assessing a workplace culture for strengths and weaknesses is a great place to start. And there are many options out there for us to be able to assess our workplace culture, but one that I always like to talk about is one that evolved out of Canada's National Voluntary Standard for Workplace Psychological Health and Safety. And the platform is called Guarding Minds at Work, and they have a website that is just guardingmindsatwork.ca, and it's a third-party online platform that provides employers with extensive resources to be able to communicate about a workplace psychological health and safety assessment and to be able to deliver that assessment. It's all anonymous, it aggregates all the data, and it gives you a beautiful bar graph to show you where you are along multiple different psychosocial factors, such as civility and respect, workplace safety, recognition and reward, clear leadership and expectations. It's a great way for us to get a snapshot of where our workplace culture is and what, if anything, we need to get better at. And one of the things I like a lot about that assessment is that for every area that it measures, if you're not doing particularly well in that area, it provides a list of up to 30 different things that you could try to do to improve your performance in those areas. In order for something like that to happen in a workplace, leaders have to be the culture champion. This is an incredibly important factor in workplace equity, diversity, and inclusion, and one that I think is an emerging leadership skill. I don't know how businesses will thrive given the workforce demographic changes that we're facing and the struggles to attract and retain talent. I don't know how those workplaces will thrive without leaders who champion equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I really think that's an emerging leadership skill. Establishing team norms based on the culture that you want, establishing that, hey, we'll look out for each other. If somebody says something that we think is harmful to someone, or if someone's not including someone inadvertently, we'll speak up about it. What are the normal things that you will do in a work environment to make it more inclusive? Talk about those things, add them to your meeting agenda. This is an easy way to develop intentional workplace culture, is just talking about things. A little bit of healthy debate, not a bad thing. What gets measured gets done, what's rewarded gets repeated. Again, talk about workplace culture and how it's really about the range of actions that are expected, delivered, and tolerated. Real change requires paying regular attention to these kinds of goals. The final element in framework for workplace diversity and inclusion, this collaborative and experiential learning concept. And this is something that is so valuable in terms of working with service providers because it provides all of this. Collaboration is really underestimated. Collaborating with a service provider is where the collaboration would happen that I'm suggesting, but collaborating actually makes us smarter. Neuroscience tells us that collaborating activates more of our brain. It releases oxytocin and dopamine, which are the same happy chemicals that get released when we're dancing with a loved one or hugging our mom. This increases our commitment, it increases our joy, it increases our engagement. So collaborating can actually be an extremely gratifying experience, and one that strengthens our workplace, increases our access to resources, ideas, and perspective. Action builds our capacity and teaches us much more than merely thinking about action. So hiring a candidate with a disability, when we're collaborating with a service provider to recruit, to interview a person with a disability, that collaboration and even the onboarding process, looking at what does this person need in terms of communication or accommodations, what can we do to effectively mentor this person? As you're collaborating with service providers to do that, you're learning new things, and as you're hiring that person and onboarding them, you've got a direct experiential learning scenario that is building your capacity very quickly. This is a really good way to help you fast track equity, diversity, and inclusion at work. This will result in some good hiring outcomes for you, and this is the opportunity that's before us right now. Diversity and inclusion is a sustainable workforce strategy, and really the time has come in Canada for us to develop more collaborations between employers and all of those publicly funded service providers out there that can help you source talent and help you to onboard and retain that talent, and in the process, develop more inclusive workplace cultures. When we look at disability specifically, what is the impact of hiring a person with a disability on workplace culture? Some of the other things we can expect: increase in profit, increase in innovation, increase in engagement. There's a number of things that really impact directly. And this is something that I've seen. I've spent in the neighborhood of 25 years designing and overseeing employment programs and teams of career consultants that are helping people with disabilities or Indigenous people to get into the workforce. And really what I see is it has a very positive benefit for the employer. It's very common for an employer to phone us 6 weeks after hiring a person with a disability and say things like, "This has been a fantastic experience for me. I felt nervous when I was starting, but this has actually made me a better communicator, a better employer, and it's helping me see some flaws in our onboarding process and our training process that I've adjusted that will benefit all of the people that I hire in the future." Those are the kinds of messages we get. So these are some of the things that we see as positive impacts on workplace culture. And how do we know that these things are happening? Because there's an institute called Institute for Corporate Productivity out of the United States that has been surveying employers that have been working with service providers and hiring people with disabilities. So they're seeing inclusive culture is attractive to other talent pools, so it's helping them prove that they are inclusive employers and attract talent from other diversity groups. They gain highly motivated employees. People with disabilities have higher rates of retention. It was very, very common for us to place people with disabilities in jobs they really cared about, and they were still there 5 and 10 years later. That really cuts down on costs for employers. It cuts down on staff turnover. Enhanced employee brand, improved productivity, improved customer satisfaction, all of these elements that you see on this slide. But most importantly, down in the bottom left corner of this slide, where it says new 2019, a huge percentage of employers that cited a noticeable increase in cultural competencies across the organization as a result of disability inclusion education. So working collaboratively with those service providers to hire people with disabilities and retain people with disabilities gave them insights that across all differences, such as race, gender, ethnicity, age, and improved their capacity with all of those different diversity groups. And this is what I'm talking about when I say that the workplace inclusion of people with disabilities can help future-proof your business. As we struggle to attract and retain talent in the future of work, here's a group of people that we can have free, publicly funded service providers help us to recruit and onboard, and it will make us better at recruiting people from all diversity groups. When we look at service providers are often a mystery to employers. So let's talk a little bit about them. They're publicly funded. You don't have to pay them a dime. They're typically funded by the federal or provincial government. And service providers are generally paid to serve the job seeker, and they tend to spend a lot of time focusing on the job seekers, and they don't do the best possible job at promoting themselves. They're not Coca-Cola in terms of brand recognition. Their work tends to be a little bit invisible to the business community, and that's something that we really need to correct, because there's such an incredible value right now in terms of helping employers improve equity, diversity, and inclusion. So service providers typically have teams of career consultants and teams of job developers or workplace inclusion strategists that help individuals with barriers identify exactly what it is they want to do for work, and then help them acquire interviews for those types of jobs. So what does their knowledge look like? Every day, every working day that those teams of people are out there in the community meeting with employers, they're seeing workplace cultures that get or don't get inclusion. They're seeing supervisory styles that work or don't, workplace accommodations, mentorship, factors in employee engagement and retention, effective onboarding and training methods, hiring and inclusion failure factors. Service providers witness and interact with hundreds of workplace cultures over a period of years. And they continue to have these direct interactions and observations and insights on a weekly basis. I say with complete confidence that service providers see more workplace culture than any entity I can think of. And the fact that they see so much workplace culture and that they interact with so much workplace culture and that they're specifically working on the how-to part of inclusion makes them an incredible asset to employers. And really the time has come for us to form more workplace inclusion partnerships between businesses and service providers to move the needle on workplace equity, diversity, and inclusion. In terms of talent sourcing and matching, what are the job seeker services those service providers are providing? And think about this as you're looking at it. Do these things serve you as an employer? If service providers are helping job seekers with disabilities to identify their particular strengths and interests and qualities and helping them to match those to job choices and explore those job choices, if we're connecting them to occupational training, testing, and skills development, and helping them to very specifically pinpoint environments and accommodations that are going to let them shine at work, and educating them about workplace culture and employer expectations, are those things that serve you as an employer? When service providers are bringing a job seeker forth to an employer, they've typically spent weeks figuring out exactly what that job seeker wants to do, and it's typically you. It's typically your business. That's what they want to do. Service providers wouldn't be bringing the person to you to interview if they didn't believe that, if they didn't believe the person could do the job. And they can really help with the interview process. If you want, they can help with the training process. Very often, service providers can engage in some ongoing job coaching if the person needs that. It tends to be very customized to the individual job seeker and the employer's needs to make it work. There's a lot of free labor there that helps you with a more inclusive workplace culture. So these are just some of the services that job seekers with disabilities receive. Let's look at some of the services that employers can receive here. So in terms of services for employers, the big obvious service is just helping employers with talent sourcing and talent matching. That's a significant part of what service providers do. And when we look at that talent matching piece, that's so important. Statistically, employers experience hiring failure in 46% of their hiring. So that's poor fit, poor performance, the employee leaves or is terminated. Service providers facilitating talent-matched employment experience much higher success rates than this, and they directly support the employer with the onboarding, training, and mentorship process. We can help with interviewing and onboarding support, designing accommodations or performance improvement plans, and some of those things you might find yourself using with other employees. So some of that support that service providers provide can be transferred to other elements of your personnel management. Enhancing training and orientation processes, if there's some element of the training and orientation process that because of a disability-based barrier, the person needs extra support, service providers can often provide that directly, as well providing employers with diversity and inclusion resources and coaching, and ideally improving your workplace culture through disability inclusion. Gallup's 2017 State of the Global Workplace report cites these human capital development factors as critical in improving business resilience, productivity, and growth. And it's worth noting that service providers right across Canada are addressing all of these factors as part of their daily work with job seekers and employers. We're providing individual level support to job seekers with disabilities, including increasing their self-awareness, strengths development, career development. We're helping them with personal development to unlock their potential and reveal strengths. We're supporting employers to develop human capital and maximize productivity. Because we're publicly funded, we're supporting society in terms of making sure that those huge gaps that are coming in our workforce, that they're filled, and helping to provide training and education to both job seekers and employers. These are obvious things that every service provider is doing. And I think that it's time for us to recognize this is really, really a valuable asset to the business community right across Canada. When we look at new hiring, recruitment, what are employers looking for? What are service providers looking for? And here's where I think we need to really understand that our human capital goals are identical. Both service providers and employers are looking for great talent matches, people who are invested in the job, work performance, engagement, social inclusion, valued role, independence, job retention. These are all things that service providers are seeking when they help a person get into the workforce. They're also things that are really important to employers. So leveraging service provider and employer experience, as well as workplace culture resources and tools, this is a strategy that supports our collective vision for diverse, inclusive, and resilient workplaces. Facilitation of these common goals fills a really important need for workplaces while enhancing the conditions for inclusion. What will our next steps be to work collaboratively in Canada for higher levels of workplace equity, diversity, and inclusion, and to achieve the goals that we both equally share? Some of these questions come to mind for us. What do employers want and need from service providers? What are the things that service providers are able to help with? Are there things they're able to help with that we haven't even talked about yet? What workplace inclusion questions do we have for each other? And how can we advise and support each other? How can we collaborate for greater outcomes right across the workforce in order to ensure that we're able to attract and retain talent in the future of work? Again, it is my strong belief that people with disabilities can help future-proof your business. How that gets done is up to us. Connecting employers and service providers is a big focus of the Hire for Talent project. Like I said, they have a service provider directory at their website, which is at hirefortalent.ca. I think for employers to connect with Hire for Talent, see some of the disability inclusion resources that they have available on their website, have a look at those service provider directories to see, is there a service provider near you that you could connect with and let them know that your business is interested in improving workplace equity, diversity, and inclusion, and you're interested in knowing, do they have job seekers who might be interested in the types of jobs that you have available? That's a good place to start. Simply interviewing folks with disabilities to see who is this group. I think that we have a lot of incorrect views about what disability actually looks like. And so many times we have taken folks over the years to meet with an employer, and the employer has said after the fact, I don't know what I thought disability was, but it wasn't this. This person seems amazing. I'm absolutely interested in hiring them. Take that opportunity and take the opportunity to get some free assistance from a service provider to improve your workplace. Thanks very much for your time. I hope this workshop has been valuable for you, and please do visit the Hire for Talent website and check out the resources they have there. Thanks, everyone. Bye.